So as I said, it's important to recognize and acknowledge in a real and unsentimental way the rhythms of nature, which include the shadow that Lauren Isley writes about. So that is there, and that is important. But as I also said, when the specifically Christian dimension of Easter gets confused with or collapsed into the nature festival, it can lead to embarrassing results. You've probably heard the story about the Unitarian Universalist Sunday school teacher sitting in a circle with her young charges talking about this holiday. "What can you tell me about Easter?" she asks. "Well, the Easter Bunny brings us jelly beans and chocolate, and we go to our grandparents for dinner," says one of the children. "Yes, that's right. And what else can you tell me?" "We dye eggs, and the Easter Bunny hides them, and we hunt for them." "That's a lovely tradition. But Easter is also a religious holiday. Does anyone know about that part? Is it the one where we bring flowers to church and exchange them?" "Not exactly. I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with Jesus." Stone silence. "Who died on the cross?" No response. "And on the third day..." Oh, a little boy raises his hand. "I know. On the third day, his disciples went to the tomb." "Yes, that's right. And they saw that the stone had been moved away." Yes, you've got it. "And Jesus came out." Go on. "And," the little boy concluded triumphantly, "if he sees his shadow, it means that we have 6 more weeks of winter." Well, let's hope not. We actually still have 1.5 feet of snow up in Duluth. More seriously, though, I remember a comment made by Bill Schultz in his 2006 Berry lecture, a lecture that is given each year at General Assembly by a Unitarian Universalist minister. Bill was president of the UUA from 1985 to 1993, after which he served for 13 years as director of the U.S. chapter of Amnesty International. And the title of his powerful address was, "What Torture Has Taught Me," obviously drawing upon his experience working with political prisoners. At one point in his talk, he recalled having seen a cartoon. He didn't say where, but I'm guessing it was the New Yorker, in which the signs outside an Episcopalian church and a Unitarian Universalist church on opposite corners, the signs were both visible on the corner in front of their respective buildings, publicizing their upcoming services. It was Easter, and the title of the Episcopal rector's sermon was "The Truth and Power of the Risen Christ," while across the street, the Unitarian Universalist was preaching a sermon entitled "Upsy Daisy." An upsy-daisy theology, said Bill, fails what he calls the torture test. In other words, it lacks a certain religious and moral seriousness and depth because it fails to engage the true level of human suffering and violence in the world, and it does not succeed in offering real resources of hope and healing. It does not recognize or acknowledge the black bird of death at the heart of life, let alone ways to respond. Upsy-daisy theology is a caricature of liberal religion, to be sure, but it's close enough to the mark to make me want to say, ouch. So precisely because it's a little more difficult to simply celebrate Easter as a nature festival this year, where we're still snowbound, we may question the adequacy of a purely nature-based approach, and we are given the opportunity to explore other dimensions of the story. So while I certainly don't want to ignore or forget the earth-centered aspects of Easter, the name itself derives from a pagan goddess, after all, I want this morning to pick up on the Sunday school teacher's hint that Easter has something to do with Jesus and follow where that leads. So what did it mean then for the New Testament writers to say with reference to Jesus, he is risen, he is alive? As the distinguished New Testament scholar Luke Timothy Johnson puts it, the most important question concerning Jesus is simply this: do we think he is dead or alive? The disciples' statement that Christ is risen or Jesus is alive are examples of what philosophers of language call performative speech. In a famous series of lectures given at Harvard University in 1955, and later published as a book entitled How to Do Things with Words, the British philosopher John Austin made a distinction between two very different kinds of language, which he called performative speech on the one hand and constative speech on the other. Now, hang in there with me. Constative speech is simply a descriptive utterance that states the way things are in the world. There is snow on the ground in Duluth, for example. Performative speech, on the other hand, helps to constitute or bring about the very reality to which it refers. Austin gave as examples legal pronouncements such as, "We the jury find you not guilty," or "I hereby bequeath my gold watch to my brother Bill." Or another example would be the wedding officiant's words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." My point here, of course, in this little philosophical digression is that speech about the resurrection is not constative, but rather performative. You can't truthfully speak of resurrection without, in some sense, participating in that very reality and helping to constitute it. It's not an objective thing out there or back there in history that you can point to and either believe in or not believe in. For the early followers of Jesus, the resurrection was not a separate thing that they could talk about it, but it was the all-encompassing atmosphere into which they had been swept up. It was the water in which they swam, you might say. Or to shift the metaphor somewhat and to fast forward a few hundred years, there's a fascinating 3rd century Christian text called the Acts of John, which portrays Jesus on the eve of his resurrection, gathering his disciples around in a circle and inviting them to join him in a dance. If you don't dance, he says, you won't understand what's happening. If you don't dance, you won't understand what's happening. Exactly so. Easter is simply an invitation to that dance, what the modern spiritual writer Ram Dass called the only dance there is. The Easter story is a story about coming back to life, but not in the sense of resuscitating a corpse or somehow suspending the laws of biology to effect the ultimate medical miracle. Don't get me wrong, to be resuscitated, revived, rescued, brought back from the jaws of death, as happens sometimes in the emergency room or on beaches or battlefields, that's a wonderful thing. But that's not what Easter is about. The Bible includes several accounts of such resuscitations, and other ancient religious literature is full of similar miraculous claims. Whatever one might wish to make of these narratives from a historical point of view, the fact remains that all of the people who were restored to life in these stories, whether by Elijah or Elisha or Jesus or some ancient Greek hero or pagan goddess, all of them are simply returned to the status quo of normal, mortal human life, which means that at some later point they will die and stay dead. We might imagine that as a result of their near-death experience, such people would live the rest of their lives with a deep sense of gratitude and a new perspective on the precious nature of existence. Certainly that has been true of some people in my experience who feel that they have received a second chance. They live not on borrowed time, but in what we might better call given time. But in the end, they all die, as all of us in this room will certainly, surely, one day die. Human beings are mortal animals, and we are conscious of our own mortality. What makes human beings religious, wrote the late Unitarian Universalist minister Forrest Church, is the dual consciousness of having been born and having to die. We've known this for as long as we've been human. People back in Jesus' time were not gullible fools. It's a vain modern conceit to think that our ancient ancestors were somehow more gullible, easier to deceive, more susceptible to superstition, or simply unaware of the facts of life and death, which we, in our scientific age, are finally able to see with objective clarity. This is industrial strength nonsense. If anything, our ancestors were far more familiar with and knowledgeable about death than we are, because they dwelt with it more intimately. And they knew that dead people do not rise. They knew the grim biological realities. When Jesus instructed Martha to remove the stone from the entrance of her brother Lazarus, she balked, saying in the King James translation, "Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been buried 4 days." No, we are the ones who are insulated and estranged from the reality of death. We've lost the kind of intimate acquaintance with death and dying that our ancestors had. And along with this, we've also lost what I call symbolic literacy, the ability to understand and communicate human meaning in anything other than literal, linear, and logical terms. And again, don't get me wrong, I have nothing against rationality, science, technology, and so forth. It's just that as certain of our human powers have grown, others have atrophied. And one of those powers that is weakened is the ability to imagine, to perceive, to communicate, and to create meaning in metaphorical, symbolic, and mythical ways. We downgrade and denigrate what we no longer understand. We say that's just a myth, or that's only a symbol, or a mere metaphor, forgetting that myths, symbols, and metaphors have the power to disclose real truth in ways that transcend mere logic. That's important in this context because in the story of Easter, the myth of Easter, the resurrection is a symbol of the opening up of a new horizon on all of life, the revelation of a new perspective on the natural cycles of life and death. In the words of another Easter hymn from our gray hymnal, the soul's horizons widen, past, present, future blend, and dawns upon our vision the life that has no end. Easter is not a story about the literal resuscitation of Jesus' corpse so that he might live another day, perhaps to lead a rebellion against the Romans, perhaps to run off to the south of France to make babies with Mary Magdalene, as Dan Brown proposed in his Da Vinci Code, or perhaps, as in the imaginative vision of D.H. Lawrence's short story, The Man Who Died, he staggered out of his tomb, bleeding and exhausted, only to be nursed back to health and initiated into the mysteries of the goddess Isis by one of her priestesses. These are all entertaining fantasies, but they miss the meaning of Easter completely. The events surrounding Easter speak in symbolic language about what I call coming back to life. And by coming back to life, I mean returning from the myriad ways that we distract ourselves, deceive ourselves, numb ourselves and each other, forget ourselves, flee from ourselves and each other. We are distracted from distraction by distraction, in the words of the poet T.S. Eliot. And coming back to life is a remembering of what has been forgotten, what has been dismembered, a gathering together of the fragmented and confused and frightened pieces of our souls and our communities. It is coming back to this very life, but with a freedom that is born of having transcended the fear of death. In the ancient Chinese scripture called the Tao Te Ching, the legendary author Lao Tzu wrote, "If men are not afraid to die, it is of no avail to threaten them with death." The core teachings of Jesus when he was alive and continued in the early church, the core teaching of Jesus revolved around the idea and the practice of repentance, which is one of those misunderstood words. It means literally to turn around, to return, to come back to life. It's what the contemporary spiritual teacher Joanna Macy calls the great turning that is necessary for us to heal planetary life. The great turning, returning, coming back to life itself, this life. The dance to which the resurrected Christ invites those who would follow in his way is really one that involves performance of those same practices that went on during Jesus' lifetime. The same life-sustaining activities of sharing, of celebrating together, of active neighbor love, compassionate healing, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Return to that life, to those life practices. That's what's being talked about in these stories. According to the gospel tradition, on the night before he died, Jesus gathered his disciples together for one last meal, as they had done many times before. And it didn't take a supernatural genius to see the handwriting on the walls. His days were numbered. And as he blessed and broke the bread and poured the wine, he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." The Greek word translated as remembrance is anamnesis, which means literally the overcoming of amnesia, the transcending of forgetfulness. So what is it that we have forgotten about being human, about being alive? I recall what Joseph Campbell said in his well-known interview with Bill Moyers back in the 1990s. People say that what we're all seeking is a meaning for life. I don't think that's what we're really seeking, said Campbell. I think that what we're seeking is an experience of being alive, so that our life experiences on a purely physical plane will have resonance with our own innermost being and reality, so that we actually feel the rapture of being alive. That's what it's all finally about. And the great African-American minister and mystic Howard Thurman had many idealistic young people come to him for vocational guidance, including a young Martin Luther King Jr. And he always said to them, "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive. And then go do that. Because what the world needs is more people who have come alive." The early Christian theologian Irenaeus of Lyon said more or less the same thing. In theological language, the glory of God, he said, is a human being who is fully alive. The contemporary philosopher Sam Keen observed that we celebrate enlightenment, as we should, but we really should pay more attention to celebrating enlivenment. Enlightenment is one thing, but enlivenment is the invitation. To paraphrase a country western song, you might say that we often persist in looking for life in all the wrong places. Turn around, said Jesus. Come back, return, come home to your own aliveness. So how do you discover what makes you come alive? It's different for different people, but it always includes some relational dimension. In the biblical view, both life and death are understood in relational and covenantal terms. Simply put, life is inclusion and exclusion is death. Exclusion from community. The author of the New Testament letter of 1 John expresses this covenantal view very well. He says, "We know that we have passed from death to life because we love one another. Whoever does not love abides in death." In other words, in such a covenantal view, life is understood and experienced as more than just a biological category. So let me return to Luke Timothy Johnson's question, do we think Jesus is dead or alive? And before you rush to answer, remember what I just said about the relational and covenantal dimensions of life and death that transcend biology. If he is dead, his story is completed. If he is alive, his story continues in some way within the covenanted community. Johnson's question, I almost want to call it a Zen koan, reminds me of another story with which I will conclude. It comes from a collection called Soul Food, Stories to Nourish the Spirit and the Heart, edited by Jack Kornfield and Christina Feldman. It's about a young man who had just completed his spiritual training and moved to a new town where he intended to become a spiritual teacher. He hung out his shingle, but no one came. The only spiritually interested people in town all seemed to be followers of a certain wise and well-known teacher. So overcome with envy, this young man devised a plan to embarrass the old master and gain students for himself. So one day he captured a small bird and he went to where the master was seated, surrounded by many disciples. And holding the small bird in his hands and hiding them behind his back, he spoke directly to the master. "If you are so wise, tell me now, is this bird in my hands alive or dead?" His plan was this. If the master said that the bird was dead, he would open his hand and the bird would fly away, the master would be wrong, and the students would come to him. If the master said that the bird was alive, he would quickly crush the bird in his hand and open it and say, "See, the bird is dead." Again, the master would be wrong and the young teacher would gain students. So he stood poised in front of the master, demanding an answer. "Tell me, if you are so wise, is this bird alive or dead?" And the master gazed back at him with great compassion in his eyes and answered quite simply, "Really, my friend, it is up to you." Truly, my friends, it is up to us. We all hold that little bird hidden in our hands or in our hearts. Whether it is freed and flies, whether it lives or dies, depends on the decisions we make, the truth that we perform, the life-giving practices that we sustain. To practice resurrection means to return fully, to come back fully to this life, to join in this dance, to join in the chorus of the singers of life, not death. Unlike the sparrows in Isley's little parable, though, I don't think we can ever forget the shadow of the ravenous black bird at the heart of life, nor should we. And yet we know, in a way that even the birds do not, that life is larger than death, and that love is greater than fear. The spirit of life is fragile, tender, and yet remarkably strong and resilient. And we have it in our keeping for a time, this fragile fledgling, this wild winged life. May we be wise to nurture this life wherever we find it, so that we too may live in the spirit of resurrection, that we may truly come back to life. Amen and alleluia.